All right, today we are going to talk about gun control. So we're going to start with the Republican side of the argument. Just to clarify, these aren't necessarily my views. I'm just representing what I think the best arguments from each side are. Okay, so first of all, Republicans argue that Democrats ask the wrong question when it comes to gun control. It's not an issue of whether or not people should have guns or people shouldn't have guns, but rather it's a question of, given that we have 400 million guns in the United States, should we make it harder for the people who do follow the law to then buy a gun? Criminals are the people who commit these gun crimes, and they already don't follow the law. So why would making it harder for somebody that's not going to commit a crime to get a gun make the world any safer? Conservatives point out that in advance of taking away people's rights, governments tend to take away people's guns. Germany took away people's guns, Venezuela took away people's guns, and they argue that if Americans don't have a way of protecting themselves against governmental overreach, that we're next in that line of tyrannical succession. Conservatives also say that we have a fundamental right to defend ourselves. If somebody breaks into your house and threatens your family, that you ought to have the right to shoot that person. Republicans also argue that the people that write a lot of gun control legislation don't know that much about guns, and so they say the laws are often pretty arbitrary and not really well thought out. They argue that most of the laws tend to target guns and parts of guns that aren't any deadlier than the guns that are used in the majority of gun crime. For example, they say AR-15s aren't necessarily more dangerous than pistols, they just look scarier. Or in the case of the ATF, putting in restrictions on pistols having braces, which affected short barrel rifles. Finally, they argue that more strict gun laws don't necessarily correlate with lower gun crime. Some of the big cities in the United States that have the strictest gun laws also have the most amount of gun crime. Now let's talk about gun control from the Democratic point of view. Again, these are not necessarily my views, I'm just representing the case on both sides. So the Democrats argue that there is a good chunk of gun violence that can be stopped with further gun control. For example, suicides, or accidental discharges, or mistakes that people make, or children taking guns from their parents and using them in ways that their parents wouldn't want. Or the general idea that people may buy a gun and follow the law at that point, but at some later point will not follow the law. Democrats argue that there's not really a use for a lot of the features that they've banned. They argue there's no need for somebody to have a bump stock that can basically convert a semi-automatic rifle into an automatic one. They also say there's no need for high-capacity magazines or for silencers or some of the other things that they put restrictions on. Democrats also make the point that guns don't protect us from the government in the way that they used to. The government army is so powerful that people owning guns may not make a difference if it were to come to a government versus the people conflict. They also point out that in many instances, having a gun will actually make that situation less safe. If a burglar breaks into your home, more often than not, they're just trying to get your money or trying to take some property, but they're not there to kill you. But if you have a gun and are threatening them with it as they try to take your stuff, it's more likely that that turns into a violent conflict. Was there fraud in the 2020 election? This is the Republican view. Again, these are not necessarily my views, just representing the argument for people to hear. So many Republicans argue that there was just outright voter fraud. The film 2000 Mules is a good example of this. The film alleges that these quote-unquote mules were paid like $10 per vote that they would stuff into a ballot box. And they say these mules were in Georgia and Wisconsin and Michigan. Those Republicans say this fraud was responsible for Donald Trump losing in 2020. Some Republican pundits, like the Ben Shapiro types, argue that while there may not have been explicit voter fraud, that there was this informal rigging of the election. That is to say, they say the media was lying about Trump for 4 years with respect to Russia. They say that Twitter actively suppressed the Hunter Biden story in the lead up to the election, which could have caused a huge shift in the way people were thinking about voting, and that Donald Trump really got hit with a lot of one-sided coverage on a lot of the things he did. They also argue that in some cases the government actively participated in this informal rigging of the election, like in Pennsylvania when the Pennsylvania Supreme Court changed voter laws in the weeks leading up to the election to allow for mail-in voting. They also say that Democrats also have a long history of being skeptical about election results, and it's not bad for Donald Trump to do it. They point to Stacey Abrams in Georgia, who lost the gubernatorial election to Brian Kemp, and then after was at the DNC and was on the panel of governors, even though she lost the election. And they point to Hillary Clinton in 2016, saying the only reason that she lost the election was Russian election interference. Fraud in the 2020 election, the Democratic point of view. Again, these are not necessarily views that I hold, I'm just presenting them so people better understand how other people are thinking. Democrats argue that there was zero compelling evidence of voter fraud in 2020. They point out that Trump's team, especially Trump's legal team, would say very different things to the public than they would say in the courtroom. And a lot lot of the things that they were saying in public, they didn't even allege in a lot of the court cases that they had filed. They also point out that in the case of Fox News versus Dominion voting systems, there were these text messages that came out in discovery that showed that a lot of the Fox hosts that were talking about voter fraud didn't even believe that when they were talking behind closed doors. To the point about the Hunter Biden story, Democrats argue that they were rightfully skeptical and that there was justified fears of Russian misinformation at the time, and it was the correct decision to reduce the exposure of the Hunter Biden story. On the points about comparisons to Stacey Abrams and Hillary Clinton, Democrats say that, well, they never tried to change the results. They accepted that they had lost and moved on from it, even though they think that the election was informally rigged against them. Alright guys, thanks for watching. This has been Mealtime News.